Monster Hunter World features all kinds of monsters, with some of them being these silly, goofy creatures, whereas some others are menacing calamities capable of destroying entire nations. And so in today's video, I will be ranking every single monster in Monster Hunter World in terms of difficulty. I will be ranking them from the easiest to the hardest, going from the very start of the game with Great Jaguars all the way to the end of the Iceborne expansion with Fatalis. And of course, keep in mind that this is all subjective and your experience may vary depending on the weapons you're using and generally just how you play the game. This is going to be from the perspective of someone who has cleared all the content and has put over 2,000 hours into this game. So with that being said, hello everyone, my name is Dark Hero and let's get started. So, starting off with Engineath. I feel like Engineath was a lot of people's first wall in Monster Hunter World. It's a really cool monster, it has a really cool design, all of its attacks really teach you how to play the game properly. You have to duck all of his attacks, you have to try to dodge a lot of things. He has the Flame Breath attack, so it teaches you that a lot of monsters are going to have ranged attacks as well that you have to deal with. He's also a pretty big monster, so you need to be careful about hitting the head. It's not going to be easy for all weapons, so it teaches you how to deal with that. It's a very cool monster in that regard, but nobody's gonna say that Engineath is a difficult monster, so I feel like I'm gonna put him in the easy difficulty for now. Up next we have Tobikadachi. He's also one of the very early game monsters that you fight against. He's not very difficult, he goes up in the trees, he paralyzes you and can hit from a distance by throwing his spikes. But honestly, it's not very difficult, he kinda just is a walking hitbox and he doesn't do a lot of damage too. So I'm gonna ultimately put him in tutorial difficulty. I don't think it's quite as difficult as Engineath. He certainly doesn't pose that problem. And then you also have the subspecies later on that is a bit more difficult, but this one stays in the tutorial difficulty. Now next up we have Kirin. Now Kirin is a monster that was walling a lot of people early on into Monster Hunter World, especially if you were a newcomer to the series. Doing the Double Tempered Kirin quest was likely a very difficult part for you. I know me personally, when Arch Tempered Kirin released, I even got to learn a new weapon in the form of the bow just to deal with him, and he was never a very easy monster to deal with for sure. He deals a ton of damage, he can hit you with paralysis very easily, and when he moves around he can also inflict stun on you. And with some weapons, you're going to be bouncing off of him, so you need to deal with that as well if you don't have the Mind's Eye skill, which a lot of people surely are not going to have in the early portions of the game. Now, there's also the fact that he is a very small hitbox, which means that for some weapons that are slow, like the Greatsword and the Charge Blade, it may be very difficult to hit them, which is of course going to make things a lot harder for you. Ultimately, I don't feel like Kirin quite belongs into the extreme difficulty. I feel like he is a monster that is disliked and is difficult, but not quite the highest difficulty tier, so I'm gonna put him in hard. Now next up we have Diablos, and this one I like this monster a lot. He's always been one of my favorite punching bags, if I'm honest. Whenever I want to test a build, I usually go up against a Tempered Diablos and also Nergigante. Because he is such a predictable monster, his attacks are very easy to read, and it's actually the perfect monster to learn to counter with different weapons, like for example, go in with a Longsword Foresight Slash or go in with a Charge Blade Guard Point. This is the monster that I use personally to get better at those timings. Just a really cool monster with a really fun hunt that is going to punish you if you don't play well and if you are not able to predict his movement, but if you play well enough, it's going to be very rewarding because you're going to be able to punish all of his different charges. He's also very easily abusable. You can always bait him into doing the charge that you are able to block and counter, so he's just a very fun monster to hunt. It can be some people's block, but I don't think it's quite difficult, not until Black Diablos that is. So I think I'm gonna rank him in the medium tier of difficulty because it is certainly more difficult than Engineath. I don't think anyone would disagree with that statement, but at the same time I don't feel like he is in the same ballpark as Kirin. Now next up is Juratotus, the one of the most forgettable monsters in the entire game, honestly. It's not a fun hunt and it's not a difficult one, it's by far one of the easiest. You kinda just need to wail at him, he's not gonna do anything to you. He's gonna go under the mud for a little bit and so you are able to bait him out of it, use a Sonic Bomb. But again, there's not really much that he does to you, he's by far one of the easiest monsters in the game, so he goes straight into the tutorial tier. Now up next we have Deviljho, the first DLC monster that we got in Monster Hunter World, and Deviljho is a menace. He is huge, he deals a lot of damage, he can pick up other monsters, he's insane, and there's even some lore that he might be able to hit his own tail. But let's leave that discussion to the lore masters of the community. Now, I think that Deviljho can totally be a difficult monster for some hunters, especially since you are able to actually encounter him way before you get to hunt him in the main story, because if you are a new player playing through Monster Hunter World right now, you may be able to encounter a Deviljho before you beat the story, which was not the case when it first released. And so if that is the case, he's going to destroy you with ease. Now, that being said, I don't think that he is quite powerful enough to reach the extreme tier. The more annoying thing about Deviljho is certainly the ground tremors that he does, being able to pick up monsters and throw them at you, and the fact that he is such a massive monster means that it's difficult for you to exploit his weak spots, especially if you are using a weapon like the dual blades or the sword and shield. That being said, other than a few special attacks, he really isn't all that difficult, especially if you come in prepared and you take the null berries with you. You will be able to cleanse the dragon blight and you are going to be totally fine. And so ultimately I will be putting Deviljho in hard. So initially I had put Tobikadachi in the tutorial difficulty, but I don't think that it quite stands on the same difficulty as Juratoda's, and I'm obviously going to be putting more monsters into the tutorial difficulty, and I just don't think that Tobikadachi is going to be nearly on the same level as all of them, so I will actually change him from the tutorial difficulty onto the easy difficulty. Now, Kuliaku is one of those monsters that you fight very early on in the game. He doesn't really have anything spectacularly difficult in its moveset that you have to deal with, other than maybe the rock that he can use to deal a big damage to you, and if you get hit enough it's going to lead to a stun, which can then lead to a card eventually. Now, it does have the event version for the Final Fantasy XIV quest, where he becomes huge and has the crystal, and that can actually end up carting you by surprise because you don't expect the damage that this guy can deal. So a Crystal Kulu goes into extreme difficulty, but if we are being real, I think that I'm going to place Kuluyaku fairly into the tutorial difficulty. I would say that the hardest thing about him is if you are using a slow weapon, because he has such a small hitbox, hitting him can be sometimes difficult, and early on into your playthrough you're not going to have a weapon with good sharpness, and so you're going to be bouncing off of hitting the rock that he's going to be holding on to. But yeah, ultimately I think that Kuluyaku is going to end up in the tutorial difficulty. Well, how about we follow up Kuluyaku with the other monster that was a part of the Final Fantasy XIV collaboration, Behemoth. Now, Behemoth is a really cool monster in my opinion. It's one of my favorite fights in the entire game because you have this MMO mechanics where you need to stay behind the comets, you need to have someone get the aggro to spawn the tornadoes and make sure that those tornadoes spawn on the outer edges of the arena so that they don't interrupt anyone's actions, and everyone needs to coordinate. It's a really cool experience, especially since you can have someone be the dedicated healer, someone can be the dedicated tank, and then you have two dedicated DPSs. Now, the base Behemoth is not really very difficult. There is some coordination and the quest is balanced around you doing it in multiplayer, so if you are going in by yourself you're going to have a difficult time unless you are equipped with master rank gear, that is. Still, I do think that it takes some skill and coordination to actually pull off the fight successfully. You do need to watch out for those comets, you need to make sure that you don't break them, and again, there's a lot of mechanics that players aren't used to, so that is already pretty difficult. I think it would already warrant placing Behemoth into the hard difficulty. Now, Extreme Behemoth would of course make it onto the extreme difficulty, as this quest not only reduced the amount of cards that you could have, but he also dealt a lot more damage, and the number of comets that he would spawn would be much more limited, which means that if you mess up, everyone is going to wipe out. So he becomes a lot more unforgiving, and in some players' eyes it becomes very annoying to deal with. It's a quest that took me a very long time to finally beat, probably over 8 hours with a dedicated group, but still in my opinion it's a lot of fun, but it's certainly one of the hardest quests in the entire game if you go in with high rank gear and not go in with master rank gear, that is. Now, overall I find it kind of difficult to rank Behemoth because there is such a big contrast between the extreme difficulty and the base difficulty, and the fact that there is no master rank version of this quest means that a lot of players nowadays can simply go in with their Iceborne gear and they're going to be able to destroy him. So for now at least, I'm going to be placing Behemoth in the hard difficulty. And again, keep in mind that these are not necessarily ranked in order in each tier. I may change this later on the list, but for now I'm not really ranking them on each tier. Now, next up on the list we have Puke Puke. Now Poke is one of those introductory monsters that you fight very early on. He has a very simple moveset, and he takes a lot of damage because he has very good hit zones for you to take advantage of. He can poison you, which can make things a little bit tricky, but at the same time you can cut off the tail, you can hit him pretty much any part on the body and you're going to be dealing a lot of damage. And in my opinion, he's one of the most enjoyable tutorial level monsters, but as the title implies, I'm going to be placing Poke in the tutorial difficulty. Next up we have Radovan, a monster that is very simple in nature. He's all about just rolling up and down and basically just trying to knock you down with tremors. He's really just an easier version of Uragan, which is already pretty easy to deal with, doesn't deal a lot of damage, and you can actually break his parts very quickly, so he doesn't even have the resistance or the endurance that Uragan has. That is true, there is the side spin attack that Radovan can perform, but ultimately I just don't find him to be a threat. Is one of the easiest monsters to deal with. Maybe he's not quite on the same level as the tutorial monsters, but I do believe that he takes up a spot in the easy tier. So initially I had put Anjanath on the easy difficulty, but whenever I take a look at the list of all of the monsters that I will be ranking, Anjanath simply doesn't compare to all of these monsters that are present on the easy list and below, so he's actually getting promoted into the medium difficulty tier, especially since he was the first wall for a lot of players. And up next we have the classic Rathalos. Now Rathalos can be a bit of a pain, especially if you are a newcomer, you don't come equipped with an antidote or a medicinal herb, and especially if you don't bring flash pods, you're not going to be taking him out of the sky, and if you have a melee weapon, that can get very tricky. He doesn't actually do a lot of damage, but it's the fact that sometimes you're not going to be able to hit him for a long time, which can lead to you getting frustrated, and eventually you get hit by a series of combos that leaves you stunned and poisoned and burning all at the same time, and that is what can eventually lead to your death. That being said, he's very easy to counter. Just bring a flash pod with you, and you can also bring a couple of traps with you that you can use right after the flash pod effect is over, but let's be real, you can do that with pretty much every monster in the game apart from the Elder Dragons. So because Rathalos is going to be one of those monsters that is going to force a lot of newcomers into trying to adapt to how the monster behaves and how to plan their items accordingly, I do believe that Rathalos warrants being in the medium difficulty tier. He doesn't quite get into the hard difficulty in my opinion, but he certainly deserves being in medium. Next up we have Great Jagras. He is of course going into the tutorial difficulty tier, as he is the very first large monster that you get to hunt in the game. Now of course there is the Greatest Jagras event quest, where he actually is able to kill you very easily. He actually deals a lot of damage in that event quest, but best of all, he can drop decorations for you to pick up. Now given that that is a very specific event quest, I'm not going to take that into account here, and so Great Jagras is going into the tutorial tier naturally. Now up next we have Baroth, and he is a very simple, straightforward monster that is just going to charge at you. There is the mud aspect of the battle where you need to be careful not to get hit with it because you're going to be afflicted with water blight, and you are going to be slowed down, which can lead to Baroth hitting a big powerful charge against you, and that can potentially lead to a cart. Ultimately he is still very easy to dodge, and so long as you don't keep on hitting its face, you're going to do well against him. So Baroth, without a shadow of a doubt, stays in the easy tier. Up next we have one of the coolest monsters that was added in Monster Hunter World, and that is Odogaron. Or is it Odogaron? He's a really agile monster that is capable of inflicting you with bleed, and the way that he moves around the map, being able to jump onto walls and hitting you with the tail really quickly, can be very tricky for hunters that are using very slow weapons. Still, I don't think that he is particularly difficult to deal with. I think I'm going to ultimately be moving up Odogaron to the bottom of medium tier because he is certainly more difficult than all these other monsters. Yeah, I think that this is fair. Next monster we have Paolumu. Now Paolumu has a very easy to deal with and understandable moveset. He does move around quite a bit, and if you are not careful, getting hit with the tail slap can actually deal a lot of damage. But honestly, he's not that threatening. There's plenty of ways for you to deal with him, and he's also very easy for you to break parts, which is going to allow you to get a KO and deal a ton of damage. You're going to need to deal with a ranged attack here and there, so that can be a bit annoying, but honestly I cannot in good conscience place Paolumu any higher than easy. And following Palumu, we have yet another cute monster, Dodogama. Now Dodogama, he really doesn't do much. He eats up rocks, he shoots up those rocks, and when he is eating rocks you deal even more damage to him. He's just a very easy monster to deal with that you end up fighting for the first time pretty late into your playthrough, and as a result he's going to feel like a cakewalk. So I think that if you fought Dodogama much earlier on, I would put him in the easy difficulty, but because you find him in the Elder's Recess, I'm actually going to place Dodogama into the tutorial difficulty. And after that we have Great Gyros or Great Gyros. He's a very straightforward monster, he doesn't really move very fast, he can bite you and he can spit a paralyzing blast, so that can be very annoying to deal with, especially if you find yourself in the middle of a pack with other gyros. You can essentially just be stun locked for a very long time and that can lead to your death. And also because you find Great Gyros in the Rotten Vale, you may not be used to the mechanic that you need to use the torch pod to be able to get rid of the effluvia. That can lead to your HP running down very quickly, and so you can actually end up carting to Great Gyros. Now I don't think that quite warrants placing him in the medium difficulty. Yeah, ultimately I do believe that Great Gyros really isn't that difficult, but he does have a few mechanics that can make him tricky for new players, and the paralysis can actually lead to a cart very easily if you don't deal with it. So he doesn't quite reach the tutorial level, but he's also just the bottom of the easy tier. Now, up next we have a monster that I'm sure everyone loves. We have Lavazio. And this one I just don't know how to rank because his fight doesn't really have a lot going on. It's kind of like the Jurototus, but you need to get him out of the lava, and that can get very annoying. He doesn't do a lot of damage with the fireballs that he does while he is below the lava, and he does have a projectile while he is outside, but it is so slow that you are able to easily dodge it. So if I had a tier for annoying monsters, he would be at the top. But in terms of difficulty, I find it very hard to rank him. I think I'm going to be ranking Lavazioth at a pretty high easy tier difficulty just because of how annoying he can be to deal with, and those frustrating moments can lead to some mistakes which can make things a bit trickier, but he's never really going to be difficult. Now up next we're going to rank Legiana. Now she is a fairly easy to deal with flying wyvern. She doesn't really do a lot of things. She places down ice on the floor, which is going to inflict you with ice blight of course, but other than that she doesn't really do much. She's going to be annoying because she's going to fly up in the air a whole lot and she's going to keep on screaming and screaming and screaming, so that is of course going to be annoying. But that doesn't necessarily translate to difficulty, and so I think that I'm going to place Legiana as the top of the easy difficulty. Now up next we have Teostra, and Teostra can actually be a wall for some players. I know that there's a lot of people that get very upset about his Nova mechanic, because if they don't flash it or they don't Superman dive, they're going to be one shot more likely than not. That being said, I always find that Teostra is one of the easiest Elder Dragons to deal with, because he doesn't really move around a whole lot, his attacks don't cover a huge area, they're very easy to dodge, and even the blast powders that he puts down on the floor, there's going to be many gaps in between where you're able to evade the blast and you're going to be fine. And the truth is that Teostra simply has a big ass head for you to hit it with, and he's going to take a lot of damage, you're going to break it, you're going to deal even more damage. He's absolutely one of the easiest Elder Dragons in the entire game, so I think that I'm actually going to put Teostra just for the one-shot mechanic with the Nova at the top of medium tier, but it doesn't quite reach the hard difficulty. Although it is true that his aura can make him difficult into master rank. Now, moving on, why don't we go over to Lunastra? And Lunastra is honestly one of the hardest Elder Dragons for you to get started with. I think it takes a lot of time for you to get used to her playstyle. Not only is she very annoying with her Nova, but she deals a lot of damage, you need to use your consumable items well, and her aura is also very annoying. She's kind of like Teostra on steroids basically, and that can already be very powerful. I'm not quite sure if I would place Lunastra into extreme, but she is definitely one of the hardest monsters in the game. Up next we have Titiyaku, and this monster really doesn't do a lot other than blinding you every now and again, which is going to be annoying. It's going to lead to a stun, and if there is another monster on the area, that can lead to you getting carted because, hey, you are stunned, you're getting hit. That being said, it's very easy for you to deal with Titiyaku. Not only is it easy to avoid the flashbang that it does, if there's ever any other monster in the area, you can quite simply just use a dunk pot on them and that'll be done. So again, Titiyaku kind of goes into this category of very easy to deal with that are also very annoying, so I think that I'm going to place him in the tutorial tier. Next up we have Rathian, and she's a very easy monster to deal with. She's kind of your introduction to the bigger monsters of the game, where she is going to use fireballs and she's going to rush at you, and that's pretty much all she ever does, apart from her tailspin attack that is going to poison you. But all of these attacks are extremely well telegraphed, and you are only ever going to get hit by them if you are a newcomer to the series. Now, it can be annoying running into the same issue with Rathalos, where she is going to stun you, poison you, and apply Fire Blight all at the same time, but because she is so predictable, I don't feel like she is hard enough to go any higher than the bottom of medium tier, because Rathian is one of the most predictable monsters in the entire game. Like, she has a very simple, straightforward moveset that is always predictable. Again, she is going to surprise you if you are a new player, but if you're not, you know how to deal with her. And it's true, you do find Rathian very early on. You can actually fight a Rathian as soon as you enter the Wild Spiral Waste, and I think that that can be difficult for some players, so that's another thing, another reason why I think she stays in the medium tier. Now let's move on to one of the most boring monsters in the entire game, and that is none other than Zora Magdaros. How do I even rank this thing in terms of difficulty? Because 99% of the fight is just going to be you using cannonballs against him, and while you are playing through the story, you're going to be mining those big rocks, but that is pretty much it you're doing. There's not really any mechanic going on with this. It kind of feels like a tutorial quest for a siege quest. It's by far one of the most sleeper fights in the entire series, but hey, at the very least you are rewarded with one of the coolest armor sets in the entire game, but I am definitely putting Zora Magdaros in the tutorial tier. Seriously, the only difficulty in this fight is making sure that you don't get hit by the annoying birds. That's it. Up next we have Kushala Daora. Again, a pretty annoying monster to deal with, as Kushala Daora is going to be spamming tornadoes, and that can make your life a living hell. If you don't have wind pressure negated, or you don't know how to deal with Kushala's wind pressure, you are going to find yourself in a pickle because you won't even be able to approach him. Now that isn't to say that fighting a Kushala is actually difficult, it's once again one of those things where he is actually just annoying. Still, Kushala Daora can actually output a very decent amount of damage, and he has a charged range projectile that can actually deal a lot of damage if he actually manages to hit you with it. But because that is such a slow attack, you can actually avoid it very easily, so it's not really going to affect you a lot of times. Now, because of how annoying he can be, and at the point that you fight him in, you may not have good enough decorations or armor pieces to deal with him, I think it warrants placing Kushala Daora at the end of the hard difficulty, because you're going to need to take advantage of your flash pods as much as possible, try to make him flinch as much as you can and stun lock him so that you don't end up spending the entire time of the quest just avoiding the tornadoes and trying to bait him out of their range. Now after that we have Uragan, and he's basically just a more powerful and annoying version of Radovan, where he is a lot harder to deal with. It's a lot tougher to break his parts. You're actually going to be bouncing off a lot of his parts if you don't have enough sharpness or mind's eye, and he can get very annoying with all of those tremors, and then on top of that putting you to sleep or bursting you with a fire AoE on top of those big explosive balls that he likes to leave behind. He can be really annoying to deal with. I wouldn't necessarily say that he is more difficult than maybe Rathalos or Diablos, but he is certainly one annoying guy, and so I'm placing him in the middle of the medium difficulty. Now, next up on the list, we're going to be having Azure Rathalos. Now, Azure Rathalos is just a more powerful version of Rathalos that is going to deal more damage, be more aggressive, all that kind of stuff. And he can actually be very tough in some situations, especially if he builds up enough resistance to your flash pods. So I'm actually going to be placing him above Diablos, but still below Teostra. Now, up next we have Black Diablos, which is just a female Diablos in heat. Basically, she's more aggressive than the original Diablos, she's going to deal a lot more damage, and her charged attacks are going to be much faster, but overall that doesn't really change a whole lot of the dynamic in combat. It's just, she's faster and deals more damage, but me personally, I don't think that this makes her go up in tiers. I think that I would still place her below Azure Rathalos, me personally. It should be noted that Black Diablos does get a few more moves, and in Master Rank she can be a menace with her new move, as more likely than not if you get hit, she is going to one-shot you. But still, I do find that she is very easy to read and there's plenty of ways for you to be able to punish all of her attacks, so I don't think that it warrants placing her any higher than she is currently on the list. Up next, we have B52, Basil Goose. Now this one is a really cool monster. The first time you find him, he is going to wreck you because you enter high rank, you don't have good gear, and he is going to destroy you. Now that being said, in terms of the actual fight, Basil Goose is really not that difficult. Yes, he does a lot of damage, but all of his attacks are very well telegraphed, and so long as you pay attention to the location of his scales, it's going to be fairly easy for you to be able to Superman dive out of the way of the explosion. I could maybe see myself placing Basil in between the two Diablos, but I don't think it warrants placing him any higher. Now, up next, we have one of the two different monsters that you can find in the Witcher 3 collaboration, and we're going to start off with the regular Leshen. This one is quite simply, it's pretty much just a tutorial quest where you actually need to pay a little bit of attention to what you are doing, but he's really not that difficult, with the only really difficult part about this quest being making sure that you keep Poke alive throughout it to get the attack boost decoration. Other than that, the normal Leshen is a very easy fight, and so I'm going to place him in the middle of the easy tier. Next up we have Valhazak, and this one is a pretty funny elder dragon where if you're not aggressive against Valhazak, you're going to be punished because you're often getting hit with the effluvia, and that is going to result in your max health being halved, and of course that is going to lead to more cards. He's not a particularly aggressive or powerful elder dragon, he doesn't really do a ton of damage with his moves, but the difficulty comes from the effluvia itself. On top of that, he does have a beam that covers a pretty wide range, which can make things a bit tricky for you. And that's true, the ranged beam, if you take the effluvia resistance skill, he becomes a pretty easy fight actually, probably at the bottom of the medium difficulty. But because there is so much that you need to deal with when you don't have the skill, I think that it warrants being around the hard difficulty. Next up we have Pink Rathian, and she is quite simply just a stronger version of Rathian. Doesn't really do much, a whole lot different, although she can be somewhat annoying to deal with when you first encounter her. Still, I wouldn't really put her past Rathalos and Diablos, so I think that she is going to stay around the medium difficulty. Yeah, I think that this position is perfect for her. Maybe she would stay below Uragan, but maybe not. Kinda depends on the gear you're using as well, I feel like. Next up we have Nergigante, one of my favorite monsters in the entire game. Nergigante is a bit of a difficult monster when you first encounter him, especially because he is a monster that is going to really punish your lack of aggressiveness. If you are aggressive, if you are able to keep on relentlessly hitting Nergigante and match his own aggressiveness, you are only going to be rewarded as you are going to keep on breaking his spikes, and that is going to lead to a lot of KOs and just a lot more damage. But however, if you are afraid, if you're not attacking a lot, if you are focusing on defense, his spikes are going to harden, and not only is he going to deal more damage, but your weapon is going to end up bouncing off of him and you won't be dealing as much damage. So it really is a fight where you need to be aggressive, otherwise it's going to be awful for you, and I think that this is a big noob killer, especially with the big dive bomb. Still, I don't think that ultimately I would rank Nergigante any higher than Kirin, but I think that he is still a very powerful monster that is going to give a lot of players, especially the newcomers, a lot of trouble, and so I place him in the hard difficulty. Now next up we have Kulftaroth, the siege monster that we got as one of the title updates. Now this monster is very special in the sense that she is meant to be tackled in multiplayer with 4 different players, especially with a lobby full of 16 players all trying to hunt her. Now Kulf is a very interesting monster in the sense that she is essentially a damage check. You really need to optimize your build and your damage rotation as much as possible, really master your weapon to deal as much damage as possible so that you are able to break off her horns and actually complete the quest. And then there's even the Arch-Tempered Kulftaroth, which becomes even more difficult to deal with as it deals a lot more damage, and she even enters this entire new area where she can cover the entire arena on fire, she can make boulders fall from the ceiling, so there is definitely some difficulty to Kulftaroth, and I think a big part of it may be misunderstood because again it comes down to a skill check. So ultimately I'm placing Kulftaroth in the hard difficulty. Next up we have the Ancient Leshen, and this guy was a nightmare for so many players. This is another quest that you are meant to tackle in 4-player co-op, as he has a ton of HP and one of his attacks is going to bind you with his roots, and that can lead to a certain card because you won't be able to free yourself very easily. And so in those situations you're going to need to rely on your teammates, and because he is essentially a vertical hitbox, it can be somewhat difficult to hit him in the horns, which is his weak spot, and that can make things even more complicated. On top of that, he keeps teleporting all over the place, and he can send out the crows towards you to make things even more annoying. So if you are playing on a team that is not very coordinated, he is going to be very difficult. And even for coordinated teams, I do believe that there is reason for me to put Ancient Leshen in the extreme difficulty. And the final monster for high rank is going to be none other than Xeno'jiiva. Now this one is a bit of an odd case because Xeno'jiiva is essentially just a cinematic boss fight. There's not really a lot of things that are going to kill you realistically in this fight because all of his moves are very slow, his lasers are very predictable, and he has such a large hitbox that you are able to attack him non-stop. Now it can be difficult to do him the first time with some weapons like the sword and shield that don't have a lot of range, and that can make things take a lot longer, but ultimately it's not going to be a arduous journey, although it might be a boring one. So ultimately I'm going to place Xeno'jiiva in the middle of the medium tier, although I can see some people placing him even lower. Now that we have concluded the high rank monsters, I'm going to be placing Lunastra at the end of the extreme difficulty because I do believe that she is very powerful. She's going to be very annoying for a lot of players, and when you get to master rank, especially with her aura, she is going to output a ton of damage and you really need to watch out for your health. And finally there is Behemoth, where depending on the version of him that you are fighting against, extreme difficulty would be here in extreme and the base one would be, well, here on hard. But ultimately I will leave Behemoth in the hard difficulty. Before we start covering the Iceborne monsters, if you are enjoying the video, please subscribe to the channel as it really does help me out a lot and we try to put as much quality as possible into these videos. Thank you, and let's continue with the content. So, the first monster that I will be ranking from Iceborne is going to be none other than Bambaro. This iconic guy that you fight very early on, I think he is actually the first one you fight, is honestly one of my favorite monsters to fight off in the game, though he is pretty easy to deal with. His moveset is all about picking up the log and throwing at you and also ramming you with its big horns, but otherwise the moveset is really easy to deal with. You really don't have to worry about anything. He also takes a ton of damage, and because he is so large, it's very easy to hit him, and he never felt like a difficult monster to fight against. In fact, he always felt like an easy one, so I am ultimately going to put him at the top of the tutorial list. Actually, yeah, because he covers such a big distance while he is charging at you, and he does it multiple times, and depending on the map you can pick up a boulder instead of the log, and throwing at you can sometimes lead to you getting hit, stunned, and rammed into a wall, and that's going to lead to a death. I think that there's an argument to be made that he also deserves to be in the easy tier, so I'm not going to quite put him in medium tier because I don't find him being anywhere near these monsters in terms of difficulty, but I will place him around here in the easy tier. So up next we have Biototus, which is also one of the first monsters that you fight off against in the Iceborne expansion. Now he really doesn't do much besides going down into the snow and trying to hit you with ice blights. He really doesn't do a lot of damage, he's very predictable, and he's sometimes annoying to deal with because you can't place down traps in the snow, and he just likes to go under the snow and you won't be able to hit him for a duration. He's got a cool design, but other than that I don't think he is a difficult fight, and I am ultimately going to place him at the top of the tutorial. I feel like that is a fair ranking for sure. So up next we have Viper Tobikadachi, and this one is a bit tricky because he can be very annoying, certainly with the poison. He's also just as agile as the regular Tobikadachi, and of course he's going to deal more damage. He doesn't have a very complex moveset, but there's still plenty of ways for you to deal with him, and by the time you find him you'll likely have a lot of antidotes and herbal medicine, so you're going to be fine most of the time so long as you come in prepared. Viper Tobikadachi can definitely pack a punch, and that is right, you do need to be careful with the poison and the paralysis both that he can apply, so he can actually fuck you up if you are not prepared. By the time you fight him, you're going to have plenty of antidotes and plenty of herbal medicine, so you will be able to deal with the poison, but because he's able to do 2 status at once, it can get tricky sometimes if you're not prepared. So at the end, I think that I'm going to place Viper Tobikadachi in the medium tier and just barely above Uragan. So up next we have Coral Puke Puke, and this one is much like the original Puke Puke, very easy to deal with. He's going to shoot some water at you, and that water is actually going to do a lot of damage, so you need to be careful and dodge that. But other than that, all of his other attacks are very predictable. He doesn't do a lot of damage with everything else, and it can get annoying the fact that he applies Water Blight to you, but other than that, I don't find myself saying that he is a difficult monster, so I think that I'm actually going to place him in the easy tier. Like here, I think it's perfect. Okay, so after that we have the Nightshade Paolumu, and this one is essentially just a more powerful version of Paolumu, deals more damage, can put you to sleep just like the old one, and he's overall more aggressive. Personally, I never found much difficulty with either of these, but because he covers a bigger area with the sleep that he can use, he can get certainly more annoying. Still, when compared to all the monsters in the medium difficulty, I personally believe that Nightshade Paolumu doesn't come close to them, so I will place him at the top of the easy difficulty, at least for now. Up next we have Fulgur Engineath, and this one is quite simply a beefier Engineath that can also paralyze you and use electricity to deal more damage. Because he deals so much more damage compared to regular Engineath, he is more agile and can also paralyze you. I think it's only fitting that I place him much higher than the regular Engineath, and so ultimately I'm going to place him in medium just below Black Diablos. I think that that's fair given the amount of damage that Black Diablos deals, and normal Basil I just don't think he's that difficult. Now up next we have Glavenus, a returning monster that came back in the Iceborne expansion and one that I am a huge fan of. Now Glavenus doesn't really have a very complicated moveset, he kind of just spins around with its tail, and sometimes he does do a lot of damage with the bigger tail slams, or especially the big spinning attack that he does have to charge up his tail, but ultimately he is a fairly predictable monster whose only real difficulty is trying to hit him in the weak spots because he is so large, so some weapons are going to have difficulty in actually dealing a good amount of damage. He does also have some projectiles by firing off a few fireballs, but they're always very easy to dodge and very predictable again, so I don't think that they should count towards difficulty. But because of Glavenus' high damage, and if you don't know exactly how he moves, you're going to get hit by the big spinning attack, which will more often than not lead to your card. I think it's fair that I place him in high medium tier. I'm going to make a slight change here on the list, and I'm going to move Azure Rathalos below Fulgur Engineath, so Glavenus and Fulgur are both going to be above him, because I think that ultimately these three monsters are more powerful, deal more damage, and can be a bit more annoying to deal with. Up next we have Nargacuga, another fan favorite that also came back during the Iceborne expansion, and this one actually in my opinion got very nerfed compared to the previous games. You still need to watch out for his quick jabs and his big tail slam, especially the double tail slam that he does when he is enraged, but I just don't think that Nargacuga is all that difficult, and he certainly doesn't have a lot of health in this game, and he can get tripped very easily, so I am going to place him in the middle of the medium difficulty. Now because Nargacuga can also apply bleed to you, and also you are often going to bounce off of hitting him in the sides, because if you don't have Mind's Eye or good enough sharpness, it can actually be tough for some players, especially if you're not used to some mechanics, and you may accidentally stumble onto its feathers and then you end up with bleed. And so if you don't have a Stera Jerky, you try to crouch to remove the bleed, but maybe you get hit in the process. So while Nargacuga does present a few challenges and troubles for you, I think that he ultimately lands in the medium difficulty. Up next we have none other than Barioth, and this wyvern is one that is going to wall off a lot of players due to its aggressiveness, the ice blights, and just the huge AoE attacks that it's able to use. It should also be taken into account the arenas where you fight against Barioth, because some of them are going to lead to tremors, which is going to make things a little bit more difficult for you. Unaware players are not going to know how to deal with his attack where he goes up onto the wall and lunges at you, or they might not be able to gauge the distance of his tail swipe, which often causes people to get hit while they are distracted. Combine that with the big AoE projectiles, and that can lead to people getting messed up really quickly. Now I don't think that Barioth has quite enough to reach into the hard difficulty, but I think that I'm going to place him at the top of medium right below Teostra and Black Diablos. Up next we have Ebony Odogaron, and this one is quite simply a more aggressive Odogaron, but this time he applies Dragon Blight on you, and he also has a few ranged attacks, but honestly it's not that different. It kind of feels like you are constantly fighting against an Odogaron that is enraged, but other than that, if you manage to move around him and try to hit him, you'll be totally fine. The only issue with Odogaron is that he has a small hitbox, but if your weapon is fast enough that you are able to hit him, you'll be able to defeat him very easily. Though that being said, I have seen Ebony Odogaron kick some players' asses. So because of the Dragon Blight and because it does move around a lot and does hit you pretty hard with some moves, I think that I'm going to place Ebony Odogaron near the tail end of the medium tier. Now up next we have Tigrex, one fan favorite returning as well in the Iceborne expansion. Now Tigrex can be a bit of a pain for a lot of players given how fast and aggressive he is, the fact that he keeps just rushing through the area from one side to the next trying to just run over you and do a bunch of spin attacks. On top of that he has his iconic roar that deals some damage, so when you couple his ability to trample all over you very easily, the fact that he has a big ranged attack in the rocks that he throws at you, as well as the big deafening roar that he can use to deal some damage if you are close enough while he is enraged, it all results in this powerful monster that is going to trample all over newcomers and is going to give some difficulty to even the veterans, although he does have a lot of exploitable moves. So ultimately I will be placing Tigrex at the bottom of the hard difficulty. Up next we have Shrieking Legiana, and she is essentially just a more powerful Legiana. She's going to apply ice in a bigger area and she's going to deal more damage, going to roar even more times, but other than that she's practically just an upgrade over the original one, although not a very powerful one. She's definitely going to force you into bringing null berries as well as flash bombs, but if you manage to knock her down into the floor, you'll be able to bash her in very easily. Other than that, the most annoying thing about Shrieking Legiana is that very often she will also call on to a normal Legiana to help her out, and that means that you should also bring a dunk pod to help you out, because otherwise you're going to have a hard time. Still, it doesn't really offer much in the way of difficulty, and if you have dealt with a regular Legiana, I feel like the Shrieking Legiana is just going to be around this difficulty. Up next we have Ian Garuga, and this one is a bit of an odd one because you find him only after you beat the Iceborne story in the Guiding Lands, and he is a very aggressive bird. He certainly does pack a punch with the big dive that he does, and his multiple fireballs can also catch you off guard and do a lot of damage. Still, I think that by the time you first find him in the game, you already have a pretty good set and you're going to deal with him fairly easily, and compared to the monsters that follow after him as you play through the game, he's not going to be a huge menace, but he is certainly one that you should respect because otherwise he's going to get you killed. So I think that ultimately I will be placing Ian Garuga high on the medium tier. I think I like this place for him. So up next we have Shara Ishvalda, the final boss of the Iceborne expansion, of the story that is, and this one is really cool because it has a couple of different phases. First you begin by fighting off against the big boulder formation that they have around it, try to remove its armor as you deal damage, and it's a bit boring to be honest, and it does get annoying especially with some weapons, but breaking through that armor is very easy. Now when you actually get to fight off against the Shara Ishvalda, you may be surprised by the amount of one-shots that thing can do. I know I certainly did actually end up failing the quest the first time with the hunting horn because I just spent so much time trying to break through the armor, and then at the end I was hit with the big spirit bomb. Ultimately a lot of its attacks are very well telegraphed, so you can actually counter them very easily, and with some weapons you'll be able to punish them as well, but I don't think it warrants being very high on the list, though whenever I look at the list of medium monsters, I think it deserves to be in the hard tier at least, so I'm putting it at the end of the hard tier. Now the next monster is going to be the flagship of the Iceborne expansion, none other than Valkana. And this one is a monster that I like a lot, especially because of the Arch-Tempered fight, where it really makes you respect its moveset, and you do need to deal with the big AoEs, the big tail swipes, and all of the powerful attacks that she does. She can be difficult at first for some players due to the big AoE attacks that she creates with the ice fields, the big ice crystals that can fall on top of you, and in general it's just a very different fight compared to a lot of other monsters, especially with Valkana being able to create some geometry that you can get on top of. Still, if we're not counting the Arch-Tempered version, Valkana by herself is not really that difficult, so long as you are able to dodge out of the way of the sword stabs with the tail, as realistically all the other attacks are actually very well telegraphed and very easy to dodge. She is an awesome monster, but I also don't think that she is very difficult or even annoying to fight against, though again the Arch-Tempered version is one of the most difficult fights in the entire game in my opinion, so I think that ultimately she deserves to be in the hard tier. Up next we have none other than Brachydios, another fan favorite that returned to Monster Hunter World, and I personally love this guy. I like that he is super aggressive. I think that given the fact that Brachydios can cover the entire arena in slime and you need to be careful not get hit by it, the fact that all of that can lead to several explosions and you can get comboed into infinity by Brachydios, that he is also very aggressive by himself and will often just non-stop attack you. I don't think he has a ton of openings for a new player to exploit, whereas other monsters I think are more easily recognizable. Other than the attack where he puts his head down on the floor and makes this wave of blast, I don't think that all of his other attacks can be very easily exploited by a newcomer, and I think that from everything that I have seen, all the new players that I have come seen into Monster Hunter, they always have a lot of trouble with Brachydios, and I think that whenever I call back my hunts with Brachydios and compare it to these other monsters, I find that I end up dying to Brachydios more than these three. So that is why I ultimately put him in the hard tier. Now, moving on from there, the next monster on the list is going to be one of my favorites, none other than Rajang. And this monkey can give a lot of pain to a lot of players. He's super aggressive, never stops attacking, and any opening that he can find, he's going to use it to destroy you. That being said, Rajang doesn't have a lot of HP, and some of his attacks like the big beam that he does or the big slam down that he does are also very easily exploitable. That being said, there's the fact that it is a lot harder for you to use the clutch claw on him, because for one, he is a much smaller target, but two, whenever you clutch claw onto the arms, he can actually pick you up and throw you onto the ground. And that is true. The only way for you to remove the enrage from him is to actually keep on hitting him in the tail, and that can be a bit difficult given how small the hitbox is. And given all of these factors, let's give him the canonical boost and put him above Kirin at the top of the hard tier. Up next we have Gold Rathian. So Gold Rathian, being the first of the metal dragons, she is a lot more powerful and aggressive compared to the regular Rathian. Not only is she able to output a much more potent poison, but she's able to do it much more often due to her more powerful and frequent attacks, especially with the double tail slam that she can perform. She's just really insane to deal with for some players, and her fireballs also pack quite a punch. So given all of that, I think that I'm going to place Gold Rathian this high on the tier list. Actually, let me put her above Velkhana. I think that's fair. You also need to do elemental damage against Gold Rathian and of course Silver Rathalos to deal with their charged up state and to knock them back into their normal form to be able to deal with them more easily. So I think that should also be taken into account. Yeah, I think she deserves to be like here maybe. But then we'll lose Kolf behind. Yes, maybe. And of course, following Gold Rathian, we of course have Silver Rathalos. And this one is of course even more powerful compared to regular Rathalos, just a lot more aggressive, has a lot more firepower, and is going to abuse it to destroy you. His fireballs now cover a huge area of effect and deal a ton of damage, and even though he doesn't go for poisonous attacks as much, they also pack quite a punch, and of course that can lead to your death if you are not careful. Silver Rathalos really shows why he is the king of the skies, and that warrants being at the top of the hard tier. Up next we have Acidic Lavinus, and this is quite simply just a more annoying Lavinus. I believe that it does deal more damage than the regular one, though the difference doesn't really seem like much, but this time he can inflict defense down, and while he does not use as many fireballs, at least as far as I remember, it doesn't really offer much again in the way of difficulty, so I am ultimately going to still place him in the medium tier. And after that we have Zinogre, a fan favorite, in fact the #1 favorite monster in the entire Monster Hunter franchise, and I believe that this is the first new monster that you encounter in the Guiding Lands. And he's actually not very difficult. In fact, I would go as far as to say that he is pretty easy to deal with. His Thunder Slam can deal a lot of damage, but other than that he is very easy to dodge out of the way of his attacks, and you may eventually get paralyzed after being hit with the Thunder Blight, but other than that I don't think he really is all that concerning. At least not the base version, so I am going to put him at the top of medium, but not any higher. It is true that you do need to gauge the distance between the different lightning balls that he does, and also you do need to be careful about his melee combo, but I never really get caught off guard by Zinogre, I feel like. Although he is certainly less predictable than Black Diablos, that is true. So these two rankings can really go up to preference, I feel like. Yeah, I feel like this would be a good one. And after that, let's do an Elder Dragon, this time Namielle. Namielle is a really cool monster. I love her design and the way that she's able to use the water and then use electricity to deal more damage and make it flow through the water. It all works well to create this really unique monster that has such a cool design. Now the fight itself is actually pretty chill for the most part, apart from a couple of moves where she goes up in the sky and kind of falls down, slapping her wings and blowing your HP up with the electricity. She can also apply both Water Blight and Thunder Blight, which can lead to paralysis, so she can be difficult to deal with in that instance. And then on top of that, there is Arch-Temper Namielle, which is certainly very difficult for a lot of players, though not quite as difficult as Arch-Tempered Valkana. Still, when compared to a lot of monsters, I feel like she deserves to have her own spot in the hard tier, so I'm getting to place her here. So up next we have Safi'jiiva, one of the most iconic Elder Dragons to be added to Iceborne, as she was one of those monsters that had the 4-player siege where you were supposed to tackle it in multiplayer, and she even had the one-shot attack where you had to stand behind the boulders. It's a really cool hunt where you need to break the different parts, and it's going to take you a really long time to be able to finally take her down. Now in terms of difficulty, Safi'jiiva doesn't have a lot of unique attacks that are going to be problematic for you, but she does pack a lot of punch, and because you are essentially on a timer to break the different parts to be able to actually take her down, you may eventually just end up doing a lot of mistakes because you are in a rush. Now of course, if you are planning on soloing Safi'jiiva, she jumps up into the extreme difficulty, but that is not the case. We're talking about the 4-player siege, and with a coordinated party she really isn't all that difficult to take down, but I still do believe that she deserves to be in the hard difficulty, and given that she even has a one-shot attack, I think that I'm going to be placing her here still in the hard difficulty. Up next we have Seething Basilgeuse, and this one is quite simply just a bigger, more powerful version of Basil that has much bigger explosions that cover a much bigger radius, and he's just easily able to one-shot you if you're not careful. And let's not forget about his big dive bomb attack that is just absolutely nuts. Given how much damage and how much area he's able to cover with his big explosions, I think that he definitely warrants being in the hard tier, although not very high because he is honestly very predictable and easy to bait into different attacks. But still, given the amount of damage that he is able to put out, I think that he deserves to be in the hard tier. And after that we have Scarred Yingaruga. Now this one is also very powerful, a much more powerful version of the regular Yingaruga. Now because Yingaruga himself does deal a lot of damage but is also very squishy and easy to deal with, he didn't rank very high. But then you have Scarred Yingaruga that racks up the aggression to 11. He's just a menace whenever he starts just non-stop diving at you, spamming those fireballs, dealing a ton of damage, and he still doesn't have a lot of health, but if he gets his head on you, you are going to regret it. Still, it doesn't quite warrant being at the top of the hard tier, but I do believe that it deserves to be in the middle of the hard difficulty. Now after that we're going to go into the Brute Tigrex, and this aggressive boy is also a huge menace, just essentially a more powerful version of Tigrex, and now this time all of his roars are going to deal damage and they actually cover a very big range, and with him being so aggressive, running around all over the place, throwing boulders non-stop at you and being able to do multiple spins in a row, is truly a menace. Still, I do believe that I have gotten used to his moveset after farming for armor spheres from him for such a long time, but I do believe that he still warrants being at the top of the hard tier. Maybe I'll put him below Rajang, cause Rajang does have that bullshit factor where he goes up into the wall to counter you. Actually, I think that is fair. Up next we have Black Veil Valhazak, which is quite simply a more powerful version of Valhazak that is going to afflict the effluvia even more often and more easily. He doesn't really stand out as he doesn't have anything particularly special that regular Valhazak already doesn't have, though the fact that you have to hunt him in the ancient forests might actually make things a bit harder for you. But given that Valhazak and again Black Veil Valhazak are essentially just annoying monsters that you have to play around their gimmick, once you figure that out and you are well prepared, you'll be able to do it very easily, so he gets to be a bit above the regular Valhazak, but not by much. Next up we have Savage Deviljho, and this one is fun because he is particularly powerful, much more aggressive with much bigger breath attacks, many more stomps, but at the same time he doesn't really offer much more in the way of difficulty, because if you already know how to deal with Deviljho, then you are going to know how to deal with Savage Deviljho. He applies defense down and he applies Dragon Blight, which are all going to make things a lot harder for you, but at the same time he's essentially just a walking huge hitbox that you can take advantage of, and so long as the big tremors don't get to you, I think that you can have a good time against him. Like maybe I'll put him above Kirin, but is it above Rajang? I don't think so. And after that we get to Stygian Zinogre, and this one is essentially just a faster, more aggressive Zinogre, although it does have a couple new moves that make things a bit more tricky for you. Still, I don't believe that Stygian Zinogre is incredibly difficult, but I do think the higher aggressiveness, the higher damage, and couple that with the new moveset with the big drill attack that he does, are enough to warrant him being in the hard tier. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to pull back Nergigante, now that I look at this. Nergigante is probably gonna go here and Ruiner is gonna go like here. Actually, I'll do this, I feel like. And up next, we have none other than Ruiner Nergigante, the monster you fight off at Master Rank 100. And personally, I love this monster, it's absolutely one of my favorites. My favorite fight to do whenever I want to test out a build, that's how much fun I have with him. I don't think he is incredibly difficult, but maybe it's because I have gotten used to him by this point. He's essentially a more powerful Nergigante that can apply bleed and has bigger area of effect damage, but truthfully, he is essentially the same. So if you can deal with the Nergigante, you definitely can deal with Ruiner Nergigante, and some of his combos can be a bit difficult to deal with given how fast they come out, but again, so long as you keep on being aggressive against Nergigante, you're going to break off his spikes, and he's going to spend most of the fight in the ground. So while Ruiner Nergigante does deserve to still be in the hard tier, mostly because of the damage that he can deal, I think that if you know what you are doing, he's going to feel a lot easier, but he still deserves a spot in the hard tier in my opinion. Actually, I'm gonna do this. After that we have Frostfang Barioth, and this one is a bit of a tough case because he has a lot of bullshit moves that are going to deal a lot of damage, cover a huge area, and knock you down consistently on top of applying Ice Blight, especially with the big area of effect attacks that can knock you up into the air, and then he's already preparing his follow-up attack. He's also got an attack where he covers a huge area on the floor, so he can actually be very difficult to deal with. Now, does it warrant being into extreme though? Yeah, he's definitely like around here for sure. Just has a lot of bullshit attacks that you have to deal with, and most monsters just don't have a lot of that to offer. Maybe it's not quite enough to put him in extreme, but definitely at the top of the hard tier. And after that we have Raging Brachydios, one of the coolest monsters in the entire game, with the special move where at the end he's able to zone you off and close you in on an area by himself with you and him alone. He's a lot of fun, he's able to put a lot more slimes on the floor, and personally I actually think that he is a lot harder whenever he is outside of that special arena, because when he enters the final arena he stops spreading the slimes on the floor, whereas when he is outside the arena he's going to cover every single area with slime and makes things a lot harder for you. Still, it's an epic fight, one that I love very much, and one that I have seen many new players struggle to fight against, but personally I don't think it quite reaches into the extreme difficulty. Up next we have Furious Rajang, and this is of course going right into extreme. This monster is absolutely insane. With how fast he is, how agile of a monkey he is, being able to, even when you flinch him, be knocked back into the wall to go back with a huge counter, his big AoE tremors, his non-stop jumps on top of the beam that deals a ton of damage, and of course the fact that you bounce off of hitting him in the arms, coupled with the fact that you cannot remove the enrage from him, unlike the normal version of Rajang, you ultimately end up with a huge ball of anger that is going to result in a lot of hunters dying non-stop. There are still quite a few ways for you to deal with Furious Rajang, but just given how he non-stop attacks you and how much damage he's able to put out, I do feel like he warrants being at the very bottom of extreme. Now for the final two monsters we have of course the two Black Dragons, and oh boy, I think you all know what's gonna happen, but of course Elatrion is going straight into the very top of extreme difficulty. This is the monster that caused so many players to downvote the game on Steam, because let's face it, not only does he have a very aggressive and difficult moveset, there's also an elemental damage check that you need to work towards, otherwise it's going to result in an instant wipe. So either you try to defeat Elatrion by simply doing a ton of raw damage and forgetting about the elemental check, or you try to break his horns and fight with the elemental advantage, but that can still be very difficult for a lot of weapons and a lot of players. There's a reason why Elatrion is hated by so many players. Personally, I love him, especially after having hunted him over 50 times by now, but there is no denying it, Elatrion is by far one of the hardest monsters in the game. And of course, the final monster on this list is none other than the final monster of the entire game, Fatalis, and he goes straight into the extreme difficulty. Now, I personally don't believe that he is harder than Elatrion. I wouldn't even put him in the top 3 difficulty quests in the game in my personal opinion, where I would put Elatrion, Extreme Behemoth, and also Arch-Tempered Valkana. But other than that, he is definitely in the top 5 most difficult fights in the game. In case you guys don't know, I only recently fought against Fatalis, and it was such an awesome experience getting to learn his movesets and trying to get better with each different attempt. Now, given that it only took me 8 attempts to finally beat him, I cannot in good conscience say that he was more difficult than Elatrion that took me like 30, or Arch-Tempered Valkana, which likewise took me probably over 20 attempts, and I don't even know the number for Extreme Behemoth, but he is certainly quite the ferocious monster that you really need to learn your timings, you really need to know the attack patterns, and he really punishes you for a lot of mistakes that you end up doing, but at the same time, it's also very rewarding that players can actually memorize the movesets and play accordingly. He is definitely one of my favorite hunts in the entire game, and very much deserving of being in the extreme difficulty. And this is how I would rank every single monster in the game from the easiest to the hardest. I know there's going to be some people that will disagree with some of my picks, and if that is the case, let me know how you would rank them differently. And you can of course expect me to do the same whenever Monster Hunter Wilds releases. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching, my name is Dark Hero, and as always, happy hunting!